Hi, I'm Susan Crawford. I'm a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. My work focuses on risks to the U.S. economy posed by failing to adapt to physical effects of climate change. Our legal and financial systems were built on an assumption of stationarity, but we need to prepare for a world of constant change. We are visibly exiting a stable climate. My guest, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who chairs the Senate Budget Committee, has been very active in this area, and Carnegie is grateful to have the opportunity to interview him today. Before I introduce Senator Whitehouse, there are a couple of items I need to briefly summarize for context. The staff of the Senate Budget Committee has released a major report summarizing the evidence the committee has gathered over the last 2 years in the course of more than 20 hearings about the economic costs of accelerating climate change, including the committee's examination of systemic risks to the U.S. economy that are triggered by the physical effects of climate change. The report includes chapters about risks to property values caused by the rising unavailability and expense of home insurance in physically risky areas, risks to local government finances, and risks to supply chains, all caused by increasing physical climate risk. The Senate Budget Committee staff has also issued a report providing a rare, data-informed look at a slice of the home insurance issue, the increasing rate of non-renewals for home insurance, and the correlations between those non-renewals and both physical climate risk and increasing premiums. It found, looking at county-level data from nearly 24 insurance companies that collectively serve 2/3 of this market, that nearly 2 million homeowners' policies were not renewed between 2018 and 2023, and that the rate of increase in the growth of non-renewals is higher, sometimes far higher, in counties facing the most severe climate risk. Researchers say that these spiking non-renewal rates, even if they're still low in absolute numbers, are often an early warning sign of insurance market destabilization and are certainly correlated with higher premium rates. Recently, our guest chaired yet another Senate Budget Committee hearing on the subject of home insurance. With that context, our guest, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, was recently reelected and will be serving his 4th term beginning in January. He is a lawyer. He was a prosecutor and a government lawyer in Rhode Island for many years before he first ran for the Senate in 2005, including roles that involved oversight of businesses and insurance. Welcome, Senator Whitehouse. It's very good to see you.
Thank you, Susan. It is wonderful to be with you, and thank you for introducing me to a new word, stationarity.
Well, we assume that the coast of Rhode Island stays
Yeah.
where it is, but you often tell this joke. How big is the tiny state of Rhode Island? And you say, it depends, high tide or low tide.
Yeah.
You're used to non-stationarity. Well,
Yeah.
when you first became a senator, you argued that America needed to take strong steps to lower greenhouse gas emissions. And you expressed real optimism that the U.S. could become a world leader in clean energy. Since 2012, you've spoken hundreds of times on the Senate floor, just about every week the Senate's been in session, about the need for your colleagues and the public to understand the fiscal risks associated with the physical effects of climate change. So, as you head into your 4th term as a senator, what's your assessment? How are we doing as a country?
I would say, unfortunately, that we're doing poorly as a country. There are bright spots. I think the Inflation Reduction Act and the investments made there in the clean energy transition are a bright spot. And the take-up of those programs by America is another bright spot. We predicted that it was going to be maybe a $300 to $400 billion investment, but these are tax credits. And if more people show up, the number goes up. And it looks like there are studies that show that we could even crest $1 trillion, which is a huge, huge, huge investment, and one that yields savings to Americans in the future in the form of lower, cleaner, and more reliable energy. So that's been good. But by and large, we've continued to increase our emissions. Global emissions still go up. U.S. emissions continue to climb, and we are not on a pathway to climate safety. We have burned through most of the scenarios that have been presented to the IPCC for how we can get to climate safety by dawdling and delay and allowing the fossil fuel industry to corrupt Congress. And we're down to about 12 that are still available to us out of 1,200. So there ain't much left in terms of safe pathways. But the good news is that, desperation focuses the attention. And two things about the 12 pathways that remain. One, they all overshoot first, which means that investments in removing carbon dioxide and other pollutants from the atmosphere are essential. And we need to continue. We've had success there. We need to continue that success. The second is that they all require putting a price on carbon. And we have been lousy at that. And the only pollutant price we've got was my methane fee, which crept in a rather industry-friendlified fashion into the IRA. But other than that, this whole prospect of it being free to pollute is what continues to drive our continued failure to reach a pathway to climate safety.
What about the assessment, the adaptation side of these speeches you've been giving about the fiscal risks to the economy presented by climate change? You keep, presenting report after report saying that we're heading towards cliffs. Have you seen understanding of that, of physical climate change as a systemic fiscal risk evolving among your colleagues? What framing or insights seem to resonate with them on that front?
Yeah, I think that is beginning to sink in. It sinks in more readily with Democratic colleagues because they don't have the instinctive flinch to protect the fossil fuel industry, which is, I think, far and away the dominant funder of the Republican Party and is now sort of the hand in the Republican Party glove. If the fingers move, you know who's doing it. More progress with Democrats than with Republicans. A good deal of progress in the media. The coverage of climate change has moved. I describe it this way. We've had three eras of responding to climate. Era one was the science era. And, God love them, the scientists did their jobs. They were accurate. They predicted very clearly what was going to happen. So 2 thumbs up for science. Bravo, well done. Then with that science portfolio in front of us, the era of political response dawned. And we made a complete hash of that, largely because the fossil fuel industry, powered up by Citizens United, massive and often secret funding, was able to derail the progress that we need to make in Congress. So that failure has now precipitated era 3, which is the era of consequences. And we're seeing that in kind of the steady growth of what I call climateflation. We just hit a new high today, for instance, for the price of cocoa because of weather conditions where cocoa is grown, particularly in northern Africa. And you're seeing that across the board. You're seeing that with shipping costs down the Mississippi because of low levels because of drought, similar through the Panama Canal, low levels because of drought. And all of that comes home to roost. But it's a fairly steady degradation of American buying power. The second big one is going to be the carbon bubble bursting, which is what happens if Saudi Arabia says, okay, we're not propping up the cartel any longer. We're going to sell all our stuff at cost plus a nickel, and everybody else goes out of business because we can't meet them for cost. You have a precipitous crash. Fossil fuel related assets become stranded assets and lose their value, creating a shock to the global financial system that has been much, much, much predicted in economic publications. And the third, which is perhaps most interesting because I think it's already beginning to happen in America, is the degradation of property insurance, homeowners insurance, where insurers can't accurately predict the risk any longer, or it becomes unbearable for them. So they back away or price people out of the market. And as the insurance market collapses, that cascades over into mortgage markets because no insurance on a property, no mortgage on that property. And then that cascades on into property markets because unless you're a billionaire buying a Palm Beach waterfront estate, you're probably going to need a mortgage. And when sellers can't find buyers with mortgages, supply and demand crash happens And that's where the chief economist for Freddie Mac predicted a coastal property values crash that would be as bad as the 2008 mortgage meltdown years ago.
So it sounds as if insurance, in particular, is a potentially nonpartisan issue that is attracting a lot of attention in the media and in the public. And there are a lot of inputs into that, as your recent hearing showed. Part of it is the cost of reinsurance, which is getting very expensive in response to recent national disasters and nearly doubled over the last few years. And there has been some inflation in construction materials, but a lot of this is climate driven. And some people say what we're seeing is the first industries reprice. First, it was reinsurance, then it was insurance. And your report shows that this is happening and that non-renewals are also correlated with higher premium increase and correlated with being in a risky place. So what fiscal
And
effects?
that it's spreading.
And that it's spreading. It's
You know?
nationwide. Although it's most pronounced in risky areas, this is
Yeah.
playing out across the country.
I call Florida the first and the worst.
Mm-hmm.
And I take a keen interest in it as a Rhode Island senator, because it is our preview of coming attractions for coastal states like Rhode Island. And clearly it's bad in Florida. But particularly when you drill down the way we did to the county level, you begin to see very robust correlation between these non-renewals, the insurer telling their customer, sorry, see you later, we're not interested, you're fired. And premium increases and documented climate risk of the area. And it popped up some unusual things, like I had no idea that Oklahoma was going to be a high-risk area.
Tornado Alley.
Yeah, hail and severe convective thunderstorms, they call them. So it's really interesting data to look at, but it also shows that it's not just Florida any longer. It is spreading, it is metastasizing. The infection goes well beyond Florida and continues to advance.
And the chain that you described, so insurance first, mortgages next, property values, we're already seeing softening in property values in climate risky areas.
Yep.
Some researchers suggest that as much as 17% of the US housing stock is exposed to physical climate risk, which will reduce home values by 20% in the next few years. What, in your view, can the federal government do to help reduce the risk of physical climate change for American homeowners?
Well, back to my opening remark, the obvious thing to do is to put a price on carbon pollution so we stop making the problem worse that is driving the insurance markets into turmoil this way. I think, as one of our witnesses said earlier today, it would be prudent for the federal government to do more to track what we tracked in our report, which is how these insurance markets are responding. As you know so well, the insurance market is traditionally regulated at the state level. And states are very possessive of that power, and the insurance industry doesn't want the federal government involved. But before you get into federal regulation of insurance, you could at least have the federal government assemble insurance company data so that we have eyes on this moving situation as it moves and have situational awareness of the problem as it develops. That would be a very easy thing to do. And there's even a Federal Insurance Information Office in Treasury that has the general job to do that, but doesn't robustly effectuate that job by drilling in. I mean, they're looking at the same data that we're looking at right now because we asked for it. So I think they should step up a lot and become a much more alert early warning sensor.
Another source of data could be the state-run public plan. So many Americans where insurance is not available are being forced into these residual plans or plans of last resort, which are ballooning.
Yeah. Here's
the problem, especially in California, Louisiana, and Florida, those state-run insurance companies are likely not to be able to pay the claims that are coming towards them. They're not probably solvent enough to handle what's coming. They may turn to the federal government to be bailed out. What can the federal government do about that to reduce the fiscal risk of that possibility?
Well, as I sit here in my Senate office, The Senate and House leaders announced a continuing resolution that has $100 billion in it for disaster relief. So in significant ways, we're already paying for it. When people have the foresight to buy into the federal flood insurance program, that gets heavily overused. So we continually have to pour money into the flood insurance program because the premiums coming in don't make up the claims going out. So we need to take a hard look at the flood insurance program and start to be serious about what the signal is to the federal budget of all this spending that just constantly goes out. By my count, since I've been in the Senate, we're over $500 billion in disaster spending that, if we'd gotten climate right a decade ago, would have been a much, much, much lower number. And as you look at that ballooning into the future, it gets even more ominous from a fiscal point of view as you look at these liabilities.
Let's turn to another financial instrument you've held hearings about, which is municipal finance, municipal bonds.
Yep.
They fund 75% of public infrastructure in America.
Yep.
Is physical climate risk being priced in to those bonds, as far as you can tell?
No. And the people who are expert in this area who've looked at this are very clear about that. There's not much debate on that subject. This is actually an adjunct of the property insurance problem. When property insurance becomes unavailable and mortgages become unavailable and property values crash, then the tax base of the municipalities, almost always based on their tax base, and in places like Rhode Island, heavily based on the coastal tax base, because that's where the expensive properties are. When that flops, then you get into real dangers with the municipal budget as their tax revenue dries up. And Moody's and the other bond companies are looking at that. And they're starting to begin to dial in flood risk and the consequential effect on municipal revenues as they are evaluating the soundness of municipal bonds. So you can get into a pretty tough area where climate change is driving the need for far more significant levels of municipal expenditure to protect the town's infrastructure. And at the same time, the revenue to support that is going down because of the damage to property values. And when those two things cross and you can't get municipal bonds any longer, you've got a really major problem on your hand locally. And again, that's where states and the federal government are likely to be asked to come in and try to fix the problem.
And as you've described, in this era of consequences, that's also tied to much of the U.S. financial system, municipal bonds, but also mortgage-backed securities, lots of rarefied instruments that all depend on this secure payment of mortgages. So stay tuned.
Here's one example from our hearings. In Florida, most of the remaining insurance companies, the big ones have left. The really cheesy ones went bankrupt. And so there are these sort of flaky ones that are there. And instead of actually getting, guaranteed by regular companies like a Moody's or something like that, getting evaluated properly, there's a new entity that has emerged that they all go to because the standards are lower. And by going to that entity and getting this approval from them, they then can move into the federal mortgage system and flip the mortgages with the insurance. And you can't sell the mortgage to Freddie Mac unless it has insurance. So you need even bogus insurance to get through that. And if Freddie Mac isn't looking carefully at the insurance, what's happening is huge amounts of that mortgage risk are being shuffled over to the federal government. So if the insurance fails, then what the homeowner does is just walk away. And the house becomes the mortgage company's problem. And if the mortgage company's the United States, then it's our problem. And it goes on to our books and adds to our debt and deficits.
Yes, it does sound like our problem. The enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, will say they're so geographically diversified that doesn't hit their books. On the other hand, the risks, as we are discussing, are creeping nationwide, and they all affect each other. As you
And
look at
particularly
your
when the
next,
data isn't good,
right,
as we're showing, why should the Senate Budget Committee be the first one to get this data together? It wasn't out there before. So if you don't know that, then you're not going to make the right decisions. You can't judge the risk. FEMA maps have been an embarrassing failure, essentially a fraud on the public for a long time now. So if you're trying to base risk off FEMA mapping, again, you're making calculations off flawed, wrong data. So it's really hard to have these big companies, particularly when they're getting these mortgages come through cleared with semi-bogus insurance. It's not at all clear that they have an accurate understanding of the risk that they're taking on.
so let's look forward. As you head into your next term, what legislative reforms, nonpartisan, can you imagine could be useful to prepare the U.S. economy to be more resilient against these climate-related economic shocks?
Well, again, we don't solve this and it doesn't get better and it just gets exponentially worse until we stop the carbon pollution. And the only way to stop the carbon pollution is by putting a penalty on it so that the market starts to work to stop it. So number one, above all, there's got to be a carbon price, a penalty for climate pollution. Then you could start to look at making the tracking of this information more robust so that FEMA maps aren't false, so that Freddie Mac isn't allowing bogus insurance to bring mortgages in, so that, we kind of stiffen up the system for this new risk so it's not leaking and creeping in. And then I've got a coastal bias. Other people are more concerned about wildfires, and very justifiably. But from a coastal point of view, we're going to keep fighting for the RISE Act, which nearly got into this continuing resolution, which takes revenue from offshore wind in the same way that Go Mesa takes revenue from offshore oil and gas and moves it to neighboring states, coastal states, and to a coastal resilience fund, a fund that can help local communities plan for these changes, reduce their risk, fund investments that are necessary to reduce their risk, and try to postpone, really evil and dangerous days of reckoning while we solve the underlying climate problem.
In this era of consequences, how do you reach voters in states that might not vote for you? For example, there are many Republican-leaning states that are very exposed to climate risk. What are messages that resonate with them these days, do you think?
Well, one thing we know from spending time in Florida and looking at the Florida election recently is that from every Democratic member of Congress's vantage point and from my personal experience, the top issue in Florida is homeowners insurance. You just cannot miss it. If I raise the issue in a meeting, every single person's head nods and they want to tell the story about their mom or their aunt or themselves or whoever and how they've been treated by the insurance industry. So it is really, really a big deal. Our party did not discuss that issue at all in any kind of a helpful way. The environmental community did not help draw the connection between what's happening with your cancellation, your non-renewal, the tripling of your premium, and climate denying politics in Florida preventing progress from being made. I think when we connect that together effectively, you'll see that the politics of this can change. There's only so long that voters who are getting punched in the face by insurance problems that interfere with the most basic asset that they have, their homes and their ability to keep value in their homes. There's only so long that climate denial can stand up against that once people understand the connection. And so I think that's the key point. And we're going to do everything we can to try to make sure that Floridians and others in this situation understand that this is going to continue to get worse for them unless and until our attitude about climate change is transformed. And it's not going to do that while people funded by the fossil fuel industry are making the decisions.
So last question, Senator. For the next 2 years, you will not be chairing the Senate Budget Committee. What are you most proud of stemming from your service in that role?
Well, I truly think we've changed the debate about climate change. People are understanding that, science, politics, consequences. Now we're in an era of consequences. We're no longer talking about polar bears or green jobs. We're talking about a true economic punch in the face for regular Americans, with the prospect of a massive economic collapse in potentially the fairly near future, either from the coastal property values crash that Freddie Mac predicted, or its evil sibling, a wildfire property values crash operating through the exact same cascade of insurance to mortgage to value, or the carbon bubble bursting if the OPEC cartel collapses or the massive subsidies for fossil fuel are stopped. All three of those things could actually happen at once. And if we did, it would be a truly devastating economic shock. And anybody who doubts me can go look at the April issue of The Economist magazine, which had as its cover article how climate change would, I'll paraphrase them, shake the foundations of the world's biggest asset class, putting $25 trillion globally at risk.
Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, heading into his 4th term in the United States Senate, thank you so much for joining us today.
Wonderful to be with you.